Hello. General Hospital today will reveal Brennan had once been regarded as a pillar of unshakable integrity within the upper echelons of the WSB, a man who embodied the agency's unwavering commitment to logic, discipline, and moral detachment. For years, he had made decisions with surgical precision, his loyalties to the organization above all else unquestioned. However, recent events had begun to erode that perception. Something had shifted in Brennan, subtle at first, but unmistakable to those who understood the inner workings of power. His once clear-eyed judgment had grown cloudy with emotion, and his actions increasingly deviated from the cold, calculated standards that had earned him his reputation. The most glaring indicator of this unraveling came when he personally selected Jocelyn Jack's daughter of Carly Spencer for recruitment into WSB operations. It was a choice that did not go unnoticed. By placing Jocelyn within the ranks, Brennan breached not just protocol, but the ideological foundation of the agency. For someone of this stature to bring in the daughter of a personal connection, particularly a woman he had begun to care for deeply, signaled an erosion for the very objectivity that WSB leadership demanded. It was not merely nepotism, it was sentimentalism, disguised as strategic action. To men like Ross Cullen, an exacting, analytical force who ran WSB European operations with ruthless precision, this move was more than a red flag. It was a declaration that Brennan's heart had begun to overrule his mind. Cullen understood what sentiment could do to an empire built on secrets and shadows. Emotional attachments were liabilities, and Brennan had just introduced one of the largest vulnerabilities the agency had seen in years. The incident at Windermere only intensified those concerns. Jocelyn, acting without clearance or oversight, had initiated a rogue investigation that resulted in a full power outage across the estate. She had gone in alone, under false pretenses, ignoring operational guidelines, and potentially exposing herself and the agency to catastrophic risk. It wasn't just an impulsive move, it was an act of outright defiance, and in the eyes of Cullen, it was the symptomatic of a far greater problem. Jocelyn was unstable, untested, and untrustworthy. She had no business being on assignment, much less within the inner circle of an elite intelligence unit. Yet Brennan had shielded her. Rather than discipline or disavow her, he had doubled down, burying her presence beneath layers of administrative silence. Cullen didn't need to see the documentation, he could sense it. And what he sensed was rot from within. His instincts led him to investigate more deeply. What he found only confirmed his worst fears. Brennan and Carly had been in regular communication beyond what was appropriate for someone claiming to operate with objectivity. Cullen knew the signs. Emotional entanglement always started with rationalizations, justifications masked as operational logic. But there was no logical reason for Jocelyn to be embedded. There was no intelligence value that could possibly offset the risks she posed. Brennan had made a reckless decision not to advance the mission, but to protect someone he loved. That alone was enough to make him a threat to the organization. But Brennan's betrayal did not stop there. When Cullen confronted him indirectly, through warnings, through procedural pressure, through thinly veiled suggestions that it was time to end Jocelyn's involvement, Brennan refused to yield. Instead of removing her, he attempted to erase her. He placed her in what the agency called sleep mode, a designation for agents too hot to handle, but too valuable to abandon completely. He wiped her identity from field rosters, scrubbed her logs, and encrypted her file into a restricted vault meant only for the highest clearance emergencies. He believed he was threading a needle, shooting her from Cullen while keeping her alive for future utility. But in doing so, he triggered a far more dangerous response. Cullen no longer viewed Brennan as misguided. He viewed him as compromised. And in the ruthless hierarchy of the WSB, compromise was synonymous with betrayal. Worse, Brennan's protective behavior had extended to more than just Jocelyn. Cullen's surveillance revealed that Brennan had withheld critical information regarding Sidwell, an asset or a double agent, depending on whose intel one believed. For weeks, Brennan had delayed forwarding reports about Sidwell's movements, fabricated dispatches about his location, and redacted key elements of operation briefings. When Cullen reviewed the trajectory of these alterations, a clear pattern emerged. Brennan had not only been shielding Jocelyn, but also manipulating mission parameters to obscure connections that could implicate her or himself in operational misconduct. The final straw came at the 5 poppies. Jocelyn had made contact with known targets, left behind digital traces, and violated several containment protocols. Brennan once again intervened on her behalf, deflecting questions and rerouting the follow-up investigation to less aggressive departments. Cullen knew then that Brennan had crossed a line that no man in his position could return from. It was no longer a question of bad judgment. Brennan had become a liability, a man willing to dismantle the safeguards of the agency for personal protection. Cullen began compiling a case not just to remove Brennan, but to eliminate him entirely. He followed Brennan's every move, intercepted private messages, accessed hidden caches, and traced communications that should have been burned weeks prior. With each layer he peeled back, Cullen found more evidence of Brennan's descent into emotional vulnerability, a man once feared for his discipline, now barely holding the facade of control. And behind it all loomed Carly, the woman who had cracked the armor of WSB's most formidable tactician. Cullen couldn't afford to let this weakness spread. Brennan was no longer a soldier. He was a defector in disguise, a man who had chosen love over loyalty. And for that, there could be no forgiveness, no appeal, only elimination. Jocelyn, though once trained in the fundamentals of covert work and deception, had always struggled to suppress her instincts, especially when faced with real danger. Her emotional transparency had been noted during simulations and drills, often dismissed as youthful intensity, but in the field it became both a liability and a dangerous form of clarity. When she arrived at Windermere under Brennan's instructions, she expected to encounter red tape, not razor-edged stairs. Matthew, the man who greeted her with a poised smile and clipped tone, immediately set her nerves on edge. It wasn't just his demeanor, it was the controlled stillness, the meticulous avoidance of personal detail, and the way he watched her as though mentally dissecting each word and movement she made. It was surveillance masked as civility, and Jocelyn knew it. The more time she spent observing him, the more she realized there were gaps, intentional ones in his background. He was supposed to be a regional manager overseeing renovations on the estate, yet he issued instructions like a commander, not a contractor. His knowledge of Windermere security systems, its underground passages, its irregular power grid was far too comprehensive, and there was something unmistakably sharp in the way he spoke, as if every sentence had been crafted 3 moves in advance. The realization hit her slowly at first, then with unrelenting certainty this was no mere manager. Matthew was a cover, and beneath it was someone dangerous, precise, and deeply informed. She began to search records, cross-referencing his speech patterns, checking digital footprints, watching the way other operatives deferred to him. What she discovered changed everything. Ross Cullen, WSB's European Strategic Director, wasn't just a senior figure. He was a key architect of the agency's deepest internal purges, responsible for eliminating rogue agents, suspected double operatives, and even long-serving members who exhibited signs of ethical drift. He ran cleanup operations with surgical finality, commanding absolute loyalty and demanding silence. The files she unearthed didn't list his name on paper assignments, but patterns emerged, agents vanishing, missions ending in sudden reassignment or execution, all traced back to corridors Cullen had once passed through. He was a shadow stitched into the framework of WSB. Jocelyn realized with icy dread that if Cullen had identified her as a threat, there was no protective designation or encrypted file that could shield her. Her mere presence was now a liability not only to herself but to Brennan, who had risked his legacy on her inclusion. She attempted to warn Brennan, but the clock moved faster than her plans. Before she could send a full report, she received a secure message from Brennan, coordinates no details, only urgency. That night, under a sky too quiet for her comfort, she found herself slipping into a clandestine meeting spot just outside Port Charles, in the ruins of an abandoned train depot. Brennan looked older than she remembered, not in years, but in burden. The sharpness in his eyes was dulled not with fear, but with resignation. He told her the truth, not the version he had constructed to protect her, but the raw, irreversible truth. He had fallen for Carly. It had begun unintentionally, a connection rooted in respect and grief, and over time, it grew into something more dangerous. Protecting Jocelyn was his way of protecting Carly, of redeeming something fractured in his own past. He admitted that he had manipulated recruitment protocols, pushed her file through silent channels, and when questioned, defended her with fabricated assessments. Worse, Brennan confessed he had withheld evidence about Sidwell, a man suspected of colluding with hostile actors within the Sidwell. Brennan had the proof, but he hoarded it, hoping to use it as leverage to maintain autonomy, to shield Jocelyn's presence from internal scrutiny, and to delay Cullen's growing interest in their circle. He planned to release the data to a neutral operative, someone outside the current chain of command, but still loyal to the agency's original creed. It was a desperate move, but Brennan no longer believed he could clean the infection from within. His grip on power was slipping, and he knew Cullen was closing in. As he handed Jocelyn a sleek, antique wristwatch, a Forstner model once standard issue during early WSB decades, he instructed her to protect it at all costs. Etched beneath the backplate was a cryptographic cipher, one that would unlock the location of a server Brennan had kept offline for years. It held everything: names, coordinates, communications, funding trails. Evidence not only of Sidwell's treachery, but of a network rotting the agency from its foundation. But they were not alone. Cullen had followed Brennan for weeks, tracing the last nodes of his activity. The train depot was the final dot in the pattern. Without warning, the crack of a silenced shot rang through the air. Jocelyn ducked instinctively, but the damage had already been done. Brennan staggered backward, a dark bloom of blood spreading rapidly across his chest. He collapsed against the rusted wall, gasping but not screaming. Cullen emerged from the shadows with chilling calm, holding the suppressed weapon as if it were nothing more than an extension of his will. His face bore no expression, only silence. Jocelyn scrambled to Brennan's side, her hands stained with blood as she tried to stabilize him. But he shook his head. There was no saving him. With trembling breath, Brennan whispered Sidwell's full name, repeating it as though embedding it into her very mind. Then he muttered one final word: watch. His hand closed around hers, pushing the timepiece into her palm with what strength he had left. And then he was gone. Cullen watched for a moment longer, as if evaluating whether Jocelyn herself should be next. But he said nothing. He simply turned and vanished, blending into the darkness with the efficiency of a man who had just closed another file. Jocelyn knelt there in silence, the weight of the watch in her hand suddenly unbearable. Brennan had died for her. He had broken every rule, manipulated every system. He lied to the agency he once served so devoutly, all for a cause she barely understood until now. And with his death, the burden passed fully to her. She was no longer just a daughter or a mistake buried in a classified archive. She was now the last link in a chain of truth too dangerous to exist inside the system. She clutched the watch tightly, knowing it was more than a symbol. It was a key, a target, a ticking fuse. And from that moment on, Jocelyn understood that her survival would depend not just on avoiding Cullen, but on finishing what Brennan had begun before the rot he tried to expose swallowed her whole. Jocelyn stood frozen in panic, her entire body paralyzed by the shock of losing the one person who had ever fully believed in her. Her heart felt as though it were being crushed under the weight of sudden, unbearable grief. But almost instantly, the haze of despair was replaced by a surge of survival instinct. Her training may have been incomplete, but the fire in her blood ignited with purpose. She knew that if she let Cullen walk away without a fight, Brennan's death would be meaningless. In a split-second decision, she lunged forward, catching